Hi there, welcome to Fantasy Hub. I'm Mia, your storyteller. Today's story is filled with heartache, discovery, and a twist you won't see coming. So let's begin.
The legal battle consumed the next 6 months of our lives, transforming our relationship in unexpected ways. My lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in white collar crime. She had steel gray hair, penetrating blue eyes, and a reputation for getting favorable outcomes for first time offenders. The prosecution wants to make an example, Jennifer explained during one of our many meetings in her downtown office. Art fraud has been increasing, and federal prosecutors are under pressure to send a message. But you have several factors. Working in your favor, no prior criminal record, clear mitigating circumstances, genuine remorse, and the fact that you immediately confessed when confronted. She outlined our strategy. Demonstrate that this was an isolated incident born of desperation rather than greed. Emphasize the medical emergency that had prompted my actions, and argue for reduced charges based on my cooperation with the investigation. The prosecution was pushing for prison time, but Jennifer believed we can negotiate for probation and restitution if we played our cards right. Throughout it all, Michelle never left my side. She rearranged her patient schedule to attend every court appearance, held my hand during the most difficult moments, and slept beside me every night even when I was convinced I was going to prison. She testified as a character witness, explaining Emma's condition and the desperate circumstances that had driven me to such extreme measures. Her testimony was composed but emotional, painting a picture of a woman who had acted out of love rather than criminal intent. Sarah Jones is not a career criminal, Michelle told the prosecutor during cross-examination. She's someone who saw a person she loved in desperate need and took desperate action. Was it wrong? Yes. Was it illegal? Obviously. But it came from a place of compassion, not greed. In the 6 months I've known her, she has never shown any sign of dishonesty or criminal behavior. This was an aberration, not a pattern. Emma herself had insisted on providing a victim impact statement, despite the complexity of her condition. She'd worked with a speech therapist to prepare a brief statement that Michelle read on her behalf. Sarah Jones saved my life. I don't condone what she did, but I understand why she did it. The treatment she made possible has given me months, maybe years, that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I've been able to see my nephew take his first steps, attend my best friend's wedding, and tell my family how much I love them while I still have the words. That's worth more than any amount of money. The media attention was intense but mercifully brief. A few local newspapers picked up the story. Local woman forges art to save lover's sister, and I became a minor celebrity in art circles for a few weeks. Some painted me as a romantic figure, a woman who had risked everything for love. Others saw me as a criminal who had undermined the integrity of the art market. Most people, thankfully, forgot about the story once the initial sensation died down. During the long months of legal proceedings, Michelle and I had countless difficult conversations about trust, communication, and the boundaries of sacrifice in a relationship. We started couples therapy with a colleague of Michelle's, Dr. Patricia Hawkins, who helped us navigate the complex emotions surrounding my crime and its consequences. Love doesn't give us license to make unilateral decisions that affect our partners, Dr. Hawkins observed during one particularly intense session. Sarah, your desire to protect Michelle was understandable, but it also robbed her of agency in a situation that deeply involved her family. Michelle Hash, my boss's mentor, offered me $45,000 to leave her. She showed me what I'd be missing. The champagne bubbles tickled my throat as I raised the glass to my lips, celebrating what should have been the worst day of my life. 13 years of marriage gone. Signed, sealed, and delivered by a man who thought our bedroom had become too predictable. But sitting in my newly empty apartment, watching the divorce papers flutter in the evening breeze from my open window, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. My name is Sarah Jones, and I'm an art therapist. Or was until the budget cuts hit the community center last month. Now I was unemployed, divorced, and somehow liberated. The hollow ache where Chester's betrayal had carved out a piece of my heart was slowly filling with something else. Possibility, maybe. Hope, perhaps. The apartment felt cavernous without Chester's presence. His cologne no longer lingered in the bathroom, his shoes weren't scattered by the front door, and the television wasn't permanently tuned to sports channels that meant nothing to me. For the first time in over a decade, I could hear my own thoughts clearly. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was pregnant with potential. I discovered Chester's affair 3 months earlier, stumbled upon text messages that painted a vivid picture of his double life. Linda from accounting had been receiving the passion and attention that had slowly drained from our marriage like water from a cracked vessel. The confrontation had been brutal in its honesty. Chester didn't deny anything. He seemed almost relieved to finally speak the truth. "Sarah, I love you," he'd said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table like a stranger. "But I'm not in love with you anymore. I haven't been for a long time." The words had hit me like physical blows, but underneath the pain, I'd felt something unexpected: relief. Because I wasn't in love with him anymore either. We'd been going through the motions of marriage. Two people sharing space and bills and a bed, but not sharing ourselves. Not really. The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly amicable. No children to complicate custody arrangements, no significant assets to fight over, just the quiet dissolution of a partnership that had run its course. Chester had moved in with Linda immediately, and I kept the apartment along with most of the debt. It seemed like a fair trade. He got his new beginning, and I got the space to figure out who Sarah Jones was when she wasn't half of a couple. The golden hour light streaming through my windows caught the crystal of my champagne flute, creating rainbow prisms that danced across the white walls. Art was everywhere in my life, even in the mundane moments. It was what had drawn me to therapy in the first place, the belief that creativity could heal what words sometimes couldn't touch. My phone buzzed against the coffee table. A text from my sister. "How are you holding up?" I set down my glass and typed back quickly, better than expected, free as a bird. But even as I sent it, I wondered if that freedom would feel as sweet tomorrow morning. The next day brought unexpected purpose. While jogging through Riverside Park, a new habit I picked up to fill the Chester-shaped void in my morning routine, I nearly tripped over something glinting in the grass. A watch. Not just any watch, but an elegant silver timepiece with an intricate face that spoke of both precision and artistry. The back was engraved: Dr. Michelle Richardson, MD, Time Heals All Wounds, a psychiatrist. The watch felt warm in my palm, as if it had recently been on someone's wrist. I could have left it with park services, but something compelled me to dig out my phone and search for Dr. Richardson online. Her practice was only a few blocks away, Richardson Psychiatric Associates. The photo on her website showed a woman with striking green eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun. She looked like someone who understood that healing wasn't always linear. The building that housed Richardson Psychiatric Associates was one of those converted brownstones that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. The waiting room smelled like lavender and contained carefully chosen artwork, nothing too challenging or dark, but pieces with enough depth to hold attention during anxious moments. I recognized the therapeutic intention behind the decor. It was the same philosophy I'd applied to my art therapy spaces. The receptionist at Dr. Richardson's office looked up from her computer with tired eyes. Behind her, I could see appointment books filled with cramped handwriting and sticky notes serving as reminders for complex cases. The phone rang constantly, and she juggled multiple conversations with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to be the calm center of other people's storms. "Can I help you?" "I found this in the park," I said, holding up the watch. "It belongs to Dr. Richardson." "Oh my God, she's been looking everywhere for that." The woman's face brightened, and I caught a glimpse of how much she genuinely cared about her employer. It was her father's. She's been absolutely beside herself since she realized it was gone. "Let me get her for you." While I waited, I studied the diplomas on the wall. Michelle Richardson had graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School, completed her residency at Massachusetts General, and specialized in trauma-informed therapy. Awards and certifications spoke of a career built on competence and compassion. This wasn't someone who'd stumbled into mental health care. This was someone who'd chosen it deliberately and excelled at it. When Dr. Michelle Richardson emerged from her office, I understood immediately why the receptionist had seemed so relieved. This wasn't just about a lost watch. Michelle moved with the kind of grace that suggested she was accustomed to carrying other people's burdens. But there was something fragile around the edges, dark circles under those green eyes I'd seen. In the photo, a slight tremor in her hands when she reached for the watch. She was taller than I'd expected, probably 5'7" to my 5'4", and wore a charcoal gray blazer over dark jeans, professional but approachable. Her auburn hair was shorter in person than in the website photo, cut in a bob that framed her face and emphasized her cheekbones. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the magazine sense, but there was something magnetic about her presence, an intensity that suggested depths worth exploring. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around me. "This watch, it means everything to me." She held the timepiece like she was cradling something precious and irreplaceable. Her fingers traced the engraving with reverent familiarity, and I watched her shoulders relax for the first time since she'd appeared. "My father gave this to me when I finished my residency," she continued, clasping it around her wrist with obvious relief. "He died 2 years later, and I've worn it every day since. When I realized I'd lost it during my morning run, I felt like I was losing him all over again." "I'm Sarah," I said, extending my hand. When she took it, I felt a jolt of connection. That had nothing to do with static electricity, and everything to do with recognition. As if some part of me had been waiting to meet this woman. Her handshake was firm but gentle, and she held on just a moment longer than strictly professional. "Michelle, and I insist on buying you coffee to thank you properly. Are you free now?" I glanced at my watch, a simple digital thing that suddenly seemed inadequate, and realized I had nowhere else to be. No job to return to, no husband expecting dinner, no obligations beyond my own choices. I love that. The coffee shop around the corner buzzed with afternoon energy, but our table felt like an island of intimacy. Michelle cradled her cup with both hands, and I noticed she wore no wedding ring. Her fingers were long and elegant, like a pianist's. The cafe was one of those deliberately cozy places with mismatched furniture and local artwork covering the walls. Jazz played softly in the background, and the smell of freshly ground coffee beans created an atmosphere that invited lingering conversations. "So, what do you do, Sarah?" she asked, and something in her voice suggested she genuinely wanted to. "No, not just making polite conversation." Her green eyes focused on me with the kind of attention that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. "I'm an art therapist." Well, was. "Budget cuts." I shrugged, trying to make it sound casual, though the loss of my position still stung. "I worked with kids, mostly teenagers who'd been through trauma. Art became their voice when they couldn't find words." "Art therapy," she repeated thoughtfully, stirring her latte with deliberate precision. "I've always believed in the healing power of creativity. In my practice, I see so many people struggling to express trauma verbally. Sometimes images speak louder than words." "Exactly." I leaned forward, animated by finding someone who understood. "There's this patient I worked with, a teenage girl named Maria who'd been through hell. Her mother's boyfriend had been abusing her for years, and she couldn't talk about what happened to her, not directly. But she could paint it. These incredible, haunting canvases that told the whole story without a single word. And in painting, she started to process it, to take back some control." Michelle's eyes lit up with professional interest and personal warmth. "That's beautiful and powerful. I have clients who would benefit enormously from that kind of outlet." "Have you ever considered private practice?" I laughed, but not unkindly. "Hard to start a private practice when you can barely afford rent. Besides, I always preferred working with underserved populations, kids who wouldn't have access to therapy otherwise." "That's admirable," she said, and I could tell she meant it. Too many practitioners get caught up in the financial aspects and forget why they got into healing work in the first place. We talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing with an ease I hadn't experienced in years. About art, about healing, about the ways people cope with loss and trauma. Michelle told me about her sister Emma, who is battling a rare neurological condition called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, a disease that was slowly stealing her motor functions and cognitive abilities. "She was always the bright one," Michelle said, her voice catching slightly. "Straight A's, full scholarship to Columbia, planned to become a pediatric surgeon. Now she needs help brushing her teeth, and I feel helpless despite all my medical training. I can understand the psychology of grief and adaptation, but I can't fix her brain." I shared about Chester's affair, how it had shattered my self-worth, but also freed me from a marriage that had been slowly suffocating us both. The weird thing is, I think I knew it was over before I found out about Linda. We'd become strangers living in the same house, going through the motions of intimacy without any real connection. The betrayal hurt, but the relief was stronger. Michelle nodded with understanding. "My ex-girlfriend used to say I was married to my work," she said casually. and my heart did a small flip at the casual mention of an ex-girlfriend. She wasn't wrong, but I think I was just waiting for someone who understood that caring for people isn't something you turn off when you leave the office. It's part of who you are. I know this might sound forward, Michelle said as we prepared to leave, the afternoon having dissolved into early evening without either of us noticing. But I'd love to see some of your work sometime. I have a feeling there's more to Sarah Jones than art therapy. She was right. In my apartment that evening, I pulled out canvases I hadn't touched in months. My personal work, the paintings I created for myself, not for therapy or healing. Others, landscapes that seemed to breathe with hidden emotion, portraits that captured something beyond the surface, abstract pieces that explored the spaces between thoughts and feelings. And scattered throughout forgeries I'd done as a hobby, perfect replicas of famous works that demonstrated a technical skill I rarely advertised. I'd started the forgeries in graduate school, initially as an exercise in technique. Could I replicate Van Gogh's brushstrokes? Could I match the precise color palette of a Monet water lily? What began as academic challenge had evolved into a sophisticated skill, though I'd never considered it anything more than an interesting party trick. Michelle came to dinner the following weekend. She stood transfixed in front of my easel. Sarah, this is ... extraordinary. She was looking at my latest piece, a stormy seascape that I'd painted the night after Chester left. The way you've captured movement and emotion. It's like I can feel the wind. It was a difficult night, I admitted, moving to stand beside her. Painting helped me process what I was feeling. May I? She gestured toward the canvas. I nodded, and she reached out to trace the air just above the painted waves, careful not to touch. You have a gift. This isn't just technical skill, this is soul work. When she turned to look at me, we were standing very close. I could smell her perfume, something subtle and warm. Her eyes dropped to my lips and back up, a question hanging in the air between us. Michelle, I whispered. Yes? I think I'm falling for you. She smiled, soft and uncertain. I think I've already fallen. Our first kiss tasted like the wine we'd shared at dinner and the promise of something I'd never experienced before. Not just attraction, but recognition. Like coming home to a place I'd never been. The next few weeks unfolded like a dream I was afraid to wake up from. Michelle would stop by my apartment after her evening appointments, and we'd cook together, paint together, talk until the early hours of morning. She had a way of listening that made me feel heard in ways Chester never had, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but genuinely absorbing what I was saying and responding with thoughtful questions and insights. Our conversations ranged from the profound to the mundane, and I found myself treasuring both equally. We discussed art theory and therapeutic techniques, but also our favorite books, childhood memories, and the small daily observations that most people keep to themselves. Michelle had grown up in Vermont, the daughter of a country doctor who made house calls until the day he died. She'd learned early that healing was about more than medical knowledge. It required compassion, patience, and the ability to see each person as a complete human being rather than a collection of symptoms. I learned that she took her coffee, black, preferred savory breakfast foods to sweet ones, and could identify bird calls with startling accuracy, a skill her father had taught her during long walks through the Vermont woods. She read voraciously, everything from medical journals to poetry to trashy romance novels that she'd sheepishly admit to enjoying. Her laughter was infectious, starting as a low chuckle that could build into full-bodied hilarity that made her eyes water. When she talked about Emma, about her fears and hopes and the crushing weight of watching someone you love suffer, I understood the depth of her capacity for caring. Emma was 3 years younger than Michelle, currently 28, and they'd been inseparable growing up. Emma had been the adventurous one, rock climbing, skydiving, traveling to remote corners of the world as a freelance photographer. The disease had robbed her of mobility first, then speech, and now threatened her cognitive function. She used to call me every Sunday morning, Michelle told me one evening as we sat on my couch, her head resting on my shoulder. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Her adventures, my patients, well, the ones I could discuss, without breaking confidentiality, our plans for the future. The last coherent conversation we had, she made me promise not to let the disease define how I remembered her. She wanted to be remembered for her spirit, not her illness. Emma's condition is degenerative, Michelle explained one evening as we lay tangled together on my couch. having progressed from hesitant touches to comfortable intimacy over the course of our developing relationship. The experimental treatment she needs costs more than I could save in a lifetime. Insurance won't cover it because it's still in clinical trials, and the pharmaceutical company that developed it prices it like liquid gold. How much? I asked quietly, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. $45,000 for a 6-month course of treatment. Might as well be 45 million. I've applied for grants, reached out to patient advocacy groups, even considered selling my practice, but it's not enough, and time isn't exactly on our side. I held her closer, feeling the tension in her body, the way she carried this burden like a stone in her chest. Her breathing was uneven, and I could feel dampness where her tears had soaked through my shirt. That night, after she'd fallen asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and thought about forgery. Not as a hobby, but as a solution, the plan formed. Slowly, methodically, over sleepless nights and anxious days. There was a small gallery downtown that specialized in discovered works, pieces that came from estate sales, attics, forgotten collections. Marcus Chun, the owner, had built a reputation for finding overlooked gems, works by known artists that had somehow escaped documentation and could be acquired for reasonable prices before their true value was recognized. I had always been good at replication. In art school, I could copy any style, any technique. It was a party trick. Really, give me a Van Gogh reproduction and I could create something indistinguishable from the original. My professors had praised my technical skill while encouraging me to develop my own artistic voice, never suspecting that I found as much satisfaction in perfect imitation as in original creation. The technical aspects of forgery fascinated me. From an academic perspective, it wasn't just about copying an image. It was about understanding an artist's entire approach to their craft. How did they hold their brush? What was their layering technique? How did they mix their colors and in? What order did they apply them? Every artist had subtle signatures in their work, unconscious patterns that were as unique as fingerprints. It took me 3 weeks of intensive research to choose my target. Charles Demuth, an American precisionist whose smaller watercolors occasionally surfaced at auction. His work was valuable but not so famous that every piece was exhaustively catalogued. I studied his technique through museum publications, high-resolution images, and art historical analyses. I researched the paper he used, the specific pigments available during his active period, even the way he signed his work. The physical creation took another 2 weeks. I tracked down period-appropriate watercolor paper, mixing my own pigments using traditional methods to ensure they would pass chemical analysis. I studied Demuth's brushwork until I could replicate his confident architectural strokes. I practiced his signature until it flowed as naturally as my own. The aging process was the most complex part. Simply creating a Demuth-style watercolor wasn't enough. It had to look like it had existed for nearly a century. I used tea staining to create the subtle patina of age, carefully applied spots of moisture damage that suggested decades of less than ideal storage conditions. I researched the specific types of frame and matting that would have been used in Demuth's era, hunting through antique shops until I found materials that would support the piece's supposed provenance. When I was finished, even I had trouble believing it wasn't authentic. The piece depicted a grain elevator and industrial buildings in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a typical Demuth subject rendered in his characteristic precise style. I'd even researched historical photographs of the area to ensure the architecture was accurate to his time period. The final step was creating a believable backstory. I invented a fictional estate sale in Connecticut, complete with fake newspaper clippings and auction records that would satisfy casual investigation, but wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. I was betting that Marcus Chun's enthusiasm for a good find would outweigh his skepticism. The gallery owner, Marcus Chun, examined the piece with a loupe, his expression growing more excited by the minute. "This is exceptional," he murmured. "Where did you say you acquired this?" "Estate sale in Connecticut," I lied smoothly. The family had no idea what they had. "I can offer you $35,000, he said finally. "It could go for more at auction, but there's always risk and attribution." It wasn't quite enough for Emma's treatment, but it was close. I accepted, my heart pounding as he wrote the check. That night, Michelle cried when I handed her the money. "I can't accept this," she said, but her hands shook as she held the check. "Sarah, this is too much." "How did you—" "Investment," I said quickly. "Some stock my grandfather left me finally paid off." She kissed me with desperate gratitude, and I buried my guilt in the taste of her tears and the knowledge that Emma might have a chance. The treatment worked. For 3 beautiful months, Emma improved dramatically. Michelle was radiant with hope, and our relationship deepened into something I never imagined possible. We talked about moving in together, about the future, about the foundation Michelle wanted to start for other patients like Emma. The investigation revealed everything with devastating thoroughness. Marcus had grown suspicious when Dr. Robert Sterling, a Dammoth expert from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, questioned certain aspects of the piece's composition during a routine authentication consultation. The brushwork was technically perfect, Sterling noted, but something felt wrong about the subject matter. The specific buildings I'd painted had been constructed 5 years after Dammoth's death. That small historical inaccuracy had unraveled everything. A detailed forensic analysis exposed modern synthetic fibers in the paper, chemical signatures in the pigments that didn't match Dammoth's known materials. My fingerprints were on the frame, despite the gloves I thought I'd worn consistently. My signature was on the bill of sale. Security cameras had captured me entering and leaving the gallery. The FBI agents who arrested me were professional but not unkind. Agent Sarah Martinez explained the charges, while Agent David Kim inventoried my art supplies as potential evidence. Federal art fraud carried serious penalties, up to 20 years in prison and substantial fines. The fact that I transported the forged piece across state lines to research Dammoth's Connecticut connections technically made it interstate commerce, escalating the federal implications. Miss Jones, Agent Martinez said as she read me my rights, I have to ask, this is extremely sophisticated work. Professional level. Have you done this before? No, I said honestly, never. Then why now? I looked at her, this woman who was roughly my age, probably had her own family and personal crises to navigate, and decided on honesty. Someone I loved was dying, and I couldn't save her any other way. Agent Martinez's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She'd probably seen desperate people make desperate choices before Michelle was waiting in the courthouse hallway when I was released on bail. Her face pale, but determined. She'd called in favors to find me a good criminal defense attorney and had driven across the city through rush hour traffic to be there when I walked out. Why didn't you tell me? She asked quietly as we sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Because I knew you'd try to stop me, I said. And Emma needed that treatment. I couldn't watch you destroy yourself trying to save her when I had the ability to help. Not like this. Never like this. Her voice broke, and for a moment she looked as fragile as I'd ever seen her. Do you have any idea what you've risked? Your career, your freedom, your future, everything we've been building together? My future is with you, I said fiercely, reaching for her hand. Emma is alive and improving because of what I did. I can't regret that, even if it costs me everything else. She pulled me into her arms right there in the courthouse parking lot, holding me like I might disappear. I love you, she whispered against my hair. But Sarah, we have to figure this out together from now on. No more secrets, no more trying to protect each other by hiding the truth. If we're going to build a life together, it has to be based on complete honesty. I realized then that my desire to protect Michelle from the knowledge of what I was planning had been as much about protecting myself from her potential disapproval as about protecting her from complicity. I'd been afraid she would see me differently if she knew what I was capable of, afraid she would love me less if she understood the lengths I was willing to go to for the people I cared about. But sitting there in her arms, feeling the fierce protectiveness in the way she held me, I understood that Michelle's love wasn't conditional on my moral perfection. She loved me completely, including the parts of me that were capable of calculated deception when desperation demanded it. The legal battle consumed the next 6 months of our lives. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, argued for reduced charges based on the circumstances, no prior criminal record, financial desperation due to medical emergency, genuine remorse. But the prosecution wanted to make an example. Throughout it all, Michelle never left my side. She testified as a character witness, explaining Emma's condition and the desperate circumstances that had driven me to such extreme measures. She held my hand during every court appearance, slept beside me every night, even when I was convinced I was going to prison. Whatever happens, she told me the night before the sentencing, we'll face it together. The judge was an older woman with kind eyes but a stern mouth. Judge Patricia Morrison had seen it all, and she studied me with the careful attention of someone weighing a human soul. "Miss Jones," she began, "art forgery is a serious crime that undermines the integrity of cultural institutions and defrauds innocent buyers. However, the court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to your actions." My heart hammered against my ribs. "You will serve 18 months of probation, perform 500 hours of community service teaching art to underprivileged youth, and pay full restitution to the gallery. Additionally, you are banned from selling artwork for profit for a period of 5 years. Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly collapsed. No prison time. I would pay the consequences, but I would pay them as a free woman. Michelle squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she might break my fingers. 6 months later, we stood on a beach in Maine, watching the sunset paint the sky in watercolor washes of pink and gold. Emma was in remission, stronger than she'd been in years. My community service had evolved into a part-time position at the youth center, and I'd discovered a passion for teaching that I never knew I had. "Sarah," Michelle said, her voice nervous and excited. I turned to find her on one knee in the sand, holding a ring that caught the last light of the day. "I know we've been through hell together. I know it hasn't been easy or conventional or anything like what either of us planned. But I also know that I love you more than I thought possible. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what you'd be missing if you ever walked away from this." The ring was simple and perfect. A single diamond set in white gold, elegant without being ostentatious. "Yes," I said, dropping to my knees in the sand beside her. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." We were married on that same beach a year later, with Emma as Michelle's maid of honor. The Richardson Jones Foundation launched soon after, helping families navigate medical crises like ours. Now, 3 years later, I understand what Michelle meant about facing things together. The woman who forged that painting was desperate and alone. I'm not that woman anymore. I'm someone who has learned that love isn't just about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It's about showing up every day, being honest about your fears and failures, and choosing to build something beautiful together. Michelle often jokes that she should thank Marcus Chun, since his investigation led to the truth that brought us closer. "Best thing that ever happened to us," she says, getting caught. And she's right, because the love we have now is built on absolute honesty, mutual respect, and shared purpose. It's the kind of love that can weather any storm, survive any crisis, overcome any obstacle. The kind of love worth risking everything for. The kind that shows you exactly what you'd be missing if you settled for anything less.